Hi, in this video, in this talk, I will discuss the construction of sexuality in pre-modern Iran. So at any historical juncture, conventional definitions of appropriate male and female sexual expressions and desires are based primarily on the established norms and standards of that given community and society. So in pre-modern Iranian society, um, also attempts to maintain a patriarchal structure was done in part by suppressing female sexuality and underscoring male sexual primacy. Now, when we discuss sexuality in pre-modern time period, highlighting female sexuality is important. Discussing sex, particularly with young women in 19th century Iran, for instance, was outside the norms of the patriarchal hegemony. So Iranian women who commonly were married at this time at a very young age had very limited knowledge about sex and had no right or limited right to express opinions over or explore their sexuality. The importance of female virginity at this time prior to marriage was a signifier of family's honor, which added to the oppressive sexual power relations and the standards and the tensions that existed at the time around marriage. All of these were important for the night of the marriage. On the wedding night, a groom was under immense pressure to prove his virility, while at the same time the bride was also terrified because she had to prove her virginity. So generally speaking, at this time, older men and sometimes powerful matriarchs controlled the most important rites of passage, including marriage, in the lives of young women and also men. And although both Islamic and pre-Islamic Sasanian law consider the age of puberty and thus marriage to be 9 years old for girls, Shia and Sunni laws allowed fathers and guardians to promise a minor girl to whoever they wished before that age of puberty. While neither young boys and girls had the opportunity to choose their spouses, if men could afford it, they could marry more than one wife and even engage in temporary marriages. At least theoretically, they could have a degree of autonomy, which was denied to women, even in the theoretical sense. Um, Also, men had the unilateral right of divorce, while men were granted, while women were granted such a right only with in very limited and rare circumstances. However, what I want to emphasize here is that with all these restrictions and um, standards, restrictive standards, and lack of formal power for women, women try to defy their fathers and guardians' decisions. And recent research by scholars have shown that many women manage to circumvent, for example, unwanted arranged marriages through different strategies, such as showing their discontent to the suitor's family or acting in ways that were deemed very inappropriate. Elite women, through family influence and connections, were often able also to initiate and obtain divorce. So within marriage, a husband had absolute legal and custody, and custody, and every type of and divorce and every type of rights and rights over even his wife's body. And she was expected to fulfill the husband's sexual desires regardless of her own wishes. Now, another clear assertion of women's assertion of power over women's bodies was the fact that the female body was considered male property, and also that women's visibility was restricted, and a wife could only show herself to her husband and set certain categories of male kin as the property of the husband and the honor of the entire family. So even in these circumstances, women's lack of power did not mean that there was an absence of resistance or absolute compliance on the part of women. For example, women could, in some cases, take advantage of provisions that allowed them to demand sexual fulfillment within marriage. Lack of sexual prowess on the part of the husband actually allowed a woman to sue for divorce. So, in some schools of Islamic law, a woman can get an immediate divorce if she claims fear of fitna, that is social disorder, which implies that the husband does not satisfy her sexually. However, in most Muslim societies, it is not socially acceptable for women to provoke a divorce on this ground. Regardless of all of these, men were concerned about their reputations for virility and masculinity, and women were worried about their virginity, and they were worried about, there were concerns about the spread of gossip if there was an absence or lack of virility and masculinity or virginity on the woman's part. Women found different ways to resist their sexual oppression and to break silences imposed on them by the sexual mores and legal prescriptions. And one way was through the use of the veil or the covering that symbolized patriarchal control to resist their exclusion from public life. In urban centers, from approximately the age of 9, girls are expected to wear a loose-fitting outfit called chador in public. In addition to chador, and this was in pre-modern period, in addition to chador, urban women wore a face covering, which was called rubande, something like the niqab, which in most cases only revealed their eyes. Now, women from the lower and lower middle class went about the city without without facing much constraint as long as they were veiled. There's also compelling evidence that the elite women who were subject to more restrictions at the time also used a veil, and often the veil of their lower class maids, to enter public places without the knowledge of their husbands or guardians. So this offered this wearing of the veil anonymously, especially the veil of their lower class maids, offered some possibilities to women, especially elite women, to visit doctors, socialize with other women on their own, or even try to interact with men in public by discreetly revealing a part of their body or their face to these men. So this anonymity that the veil afforded women enabled them to subvert some of the limitations that were put on them, placed on them, and exercise a certain degree of sexual freedom. And a similar impulse can be found in the sources about and the stories about women who cross-dressed and appeared in male clothing in urban centers. So, when unable to transcend these limitations placed on their sexual desires, women did at least sometimes manage to express their sexual frustration indirectly indirectly, including through culturally condoned female-centered rituals that allowed them to assert their needs and agency. For example, Afsaneh Najmabadi writes about these traditional practices allegedly performed as rituals to bring about pregnancy. Um, and she argues, Najmabadi argues that these rituals should be read as expressions of women's sexual agency and resistance. So, in one of these rituals called untying the knot of the trousers, women collectively sing the following song: "هاون من دسته میخواد مرد کمربسته میخواد." My mortar needs a pestle, it desires a man with a tied belt. And this is from, I'm basically quoting Afsaneh Najmabadi. And the song, Najmabadi argues, addresses women's sexual frustration and expresses their breaking with the conventions that encourage them to remain silent about their sexuality and sexual frustrations. Other strategies that women used to refuse and renounce the suppressions over their bodies and their sexualities and about the relations with men altogether was the fact that they refused to enter any sort of relationship with men, including any sexual relationships, and they preferred women. So women often used religious rituals and avenues open to them to expand both their networks and the boundaries of friendship and support to non-kin groups, that is, other women who were not family members. So through visiting, for example, shrines, particularly shrines of female saints, women could develop sires or sisterhood bonds. These were similar to the brotherhood bonds that often were included in homoerotic relations among men or in Sufi circles, for example. Despite the fact that overt same-sex sexuality was inexpressible and that even heterosexual expressions were meant to be restrained, male and female homosexual and homoerotic expressions, although deemed inappropriate for women, were widely practiced in pre-19th century Iranian society. And this was usually among people of different classes, different ages and locations. So while it was plausible to view the bonds of sisterhood as enabling sexual and homoerotic dimensions, the extent to which this happened is not clear. And what is clear, however, is that Sires included emotional bonds of solidarity outside women's immediate family groups and the immediate community. So another strategy that women use to express their non-compliance with male dominance over their sexuality was also to join Sufi circles, many of which were open to women from the late 8th century on. Now, renouncing marriage and relationships with men altogether and staying celibate was a common practice among female Sufis. However, this indicated a complete double standard um, with regard to the concept of earthly love, which was considered a breach to the divine in Sufism. Sufi men were encouraged to experience earthly love as a doorway to ultimate divine love, whereas Sufi women were expected to renounce all types of earthly love and desire and to remain celibate. So we see the double standard within the Sufi circles, even. Although male sexuality was given more importance and recognition, even in Sufi circles, Anne-Marie Chamel comments that, and I'm quoting, Sufism, more than stern orthodoxy, offered women a certain amount of possibilities to participate actively in the religious and social life, end quote. So certain Sufi shrines were exclusively open to women, and women could attend the Sufi shrines to listen to lectures and support one another and become members of a certain Sufi order. There were even members of popular Sufis such as Rumi's friend Salahuddin, whose daughter was Fatima Khatun, and Rumi's favorite female disciple, was also one attending these Sufi circles. So, although the documented literature on female Sufis and women's sisterhood bonds in Sufi circles is very scant and scarce, the most thorough source that we have in the late 17th century is Kulsum Nane, written by Mullah Agha Jamal Khansari. The book includes a chapter entitled on sisterhood sighes, that is, sisterhood bonds that were tied after a period of negotiations, basically between the two women. So the ritual would begin with a woman who sought a sister, asking a love broker to negotiate the matter by taking a tray of sweets, and I'm quoting Janet Afari here, a tray of sweets in the middle of which was a dildo or doll made of wax or leather. If the beloved agreed, she threw a white scarf over the tray. Otherwise, she would throw a black one. So there were special days when vows of sisterhood were usually contracted, such as on Nowruz and the Eid of Ghadir Khum, and the day when, according to Shia belief, the Prophet Muhammad designated Ali as his successor. Customary practices such as socializing for several months, sending love tokens to one another, and exploring compatibility would happen before tying the bond. Husbands often resented these sisterhood bonds, which they perceived as threatening to their marriage. However, the segregated nature of the social life at the time between the sexes, in many cases, helped the relationship between the women and stopped basically the husband's resentment, because the women adopted strictly female only circles for spending time with each other and meeting each other. And sometimes the process took a long time and resulted in the divorce between the husband and this particular wife. In such cases, many of these sisters remained in the relationship and did not remarry. Although Khansari's work is evidence of this form of female companionship within which women experience a degree of power and freedom as well as a deep emotional relation, it does not provide enough information about the extent to which women were sexually or erotically involved. Catherine Babayan also argues that women use traditional venues and social patterns incorporated into customary practices to establish long-lasting relationships with one another. She analyzes the writing of a late 17th century Esfahani widow regarding the separation from her female companion in her essay In Spirit We Are Each Other's Sorrow. The elite Isfahani woman embarks on a bridge, as Babayan discusses, on a pilgrimage to Mecca after her husband's death. Her grief and distress over the death of her husband, in conjunction with the powerfully effective religious rituals and prayers of the pilgrimage, renew this widow's sorrow over her separation from her female companion. So she decides to travel and pay her a visit. However, the woman's situation, including that she is married now, means that the widow must once again leave her dear friend and remain separated from her. Babayan argues that the widow's writings demonstrate clearly how her own subjectivity was significantly impacted by the dominant discourses of this time and on the desire and the institution of Sireh and this sisterhood Sireh. The widow's longing to reunite with her former female companion is evidence of the powerful female space created through the sisterhood bonds in Esfahani society. However, as Babayan also notes, writings of the time, such as this, The Widows, portray how prevailing moralistic views discredited this female companionship, forcing women bound by such ties to live apart and likely regulating their sexuality. So the widow's writings, through her writings, we can argue that society and community suppressed female expression of sexuality and displacement of prevailing male authority. The widow's 17th century account, nevertheless, reveals her struggles to assert her agency despite this. Now, female same-sex desire and relations were also prevalent in the harems of the Qajar period. The memoirs of the Qajar princess Tajo Sataneh provide information given by the court gynecologist Dr. Polak and the work of the Qajar and early Pahlavi period historian Jafar Shahri. They illustrate that many women engaged in homoerotic relations called musahaqeh at this time. According to Shahri, two categories of women entered sisterhood bonds, and this is what I'm quoting from Shahri's book. Those who were unwillingly deprived of male companionship and those who were predisposed to or seduced by same-sex relations and same-sex eroticism. Shahri's use of the term seduced may be misleading here. We can equally assume that women chose same-sex relations over the limited options available within this, the dictates of their societies and within the harem space. Counter to Shahri's portrayal of women as this passive or reactive in terms of their sexual relations, we can also argue that women were deliberate about their choice to pursue same-sex relations here. So far I have discussed female sexuality while referring to male sexuality as well, but now I want to focus on male sexuality, specifically male same-sex desire and homoerotic relations in pre-modern era, because it is also important in terms of construction of sexuality generally at the time. So while female homoeroticism was considered improper, and we don't have much research or documentation, male same-sex relations, so long as they were discreet, were a tolerated cultural practice in pre-modern or pre-20th century Mediterranean Muslim societies. Similar to European pre-modern notions, Iranian men were not necessarily identified by their sexual activities, and male same-sex relations were practiced within the framework of various categories of social relations. Now, in pre-modern Iranian society, they tended to involve pairs from different age groups, classes, or social standing, and Afari refers to this type of male same-sex relations in Iran as status-defined homosexuality, whereby adult men sexually engaged with adolescent boys who were called amrads. The adult was assumed to be the initiator and agent. The amrad was the passive recipient of the older man's affection and sexual interest. The amrad was in fact not supposed to take pleasure and in the sexual activity, and the relationship included courtship and mentorship between the adult man and the amrad until the amrad reached adulthood. Now, men who had sexual relationships with other men, that is with amrads, or with adolescent boys, could be also married and have a family on the side. So heterosexual marriage prevailed as the ideal relationship between sexes, and having an amrad in no way precluded a man from having a wife. The amrad was expected to outgrow himself, outgrow the relationship once he reached adulthood, and to marry and father children while concurrently able to enter into a same-sex relationship as the active, mature partner now. Now, the passive partner in such relationships was often object of derision, arguably because of his equation with the stereotypical submissive female role. Similar to same-sex female relationships, those between men encompassed, certain courtship rules. Unlike female companionship, male same-sex relations was tolerated and relatively accepted within the prevailing moral norms and social forces. Now, the patriarchal structure of the society through the 1800s prioritized male sexuality and accepted men's hetero and homosexual practices within a framework of generally strong surveillance of citizens' sexuality through various socio-religious and community institutions. There is a great deal of documentation concerning male homoeroticism of the time, including in classical Persian literature and Sufi poetry that from 12th century to the 15th century is filled with themes of male same-sex relations and homoerotic allusions and symbolism. In addition, while numerous codes of conduct concerning male homosexuality existed in the literature of the period, their absence regarding same-sex relations between women strongly suggests that these were considered inappropriate and disdainful. So female sexuality is almost invisible in documents of the period, and it was not publicly and it was not public articulated publicly, and it was not defined. It was defined only in reference to male sexuality. But as we see in the little documentation and research that does exist that I use for this research in my own research and um, this particular video and the talk, despite overwhelming constraints and the strong incentives to comply with traditional um, gender norms, women manage basically to find different ways to exercise sexual and social autonomy in pre-modern Iran.